It began with a phone ringing in the most unlikely of places inside the private
Yes,
home
this is
of John
Brennan.
Brennan, the director of the CIA.
You
The
cannot
man who
be
sat at the
serious.
very top of America's
I assure you
intelligence
I am.
pyramid, the man whose voice could decide the fate of nations, suddenly found himself picking up a call that seemed
CWA.
ordinary at first. But on the other end was not a world leader, not a senior operative, not even a colleague.
Yes, I am calling
It
about a
was
critical
boy,
network access
a
issue.
boy barely 15 years old, calling from the quiet West Midlands of England. He called himself Cracka. His voice carried a mixture of youthful arrogance and mischief, yet also a deep conviction that what he was doing mattered. That single call was more than a prank. It was the opening shot of one of the most humiliating breaches the American intelligence community had ever faced. Cracka was not alone. He led a small group of hackers who called themselves
Are you seeing
Crackas
this
With
list?
Attitude CWA. Together, they believed they were about to expose the vulnerability of the most powerful country on Earth. With little more than persistence and charm,
We're in.
Cracka
Access
tricked a
granted.
Verizon technician
Go,
into
go.
handing over access to Brennan's personal AOL account. From there, the dominoes began to fall. Within days, he and his crew were peering into emails, sensitive files, even government contact lists. They were no longer just kids behind a screen. They had crossed into the private world of America's intelligence leaders. It sounds almost unbelievable, doesn't it? That the fortress of secrets guarding Washington could be cracked open not by an army, not by a foreign spy agency, but by teenagers who still lived with their parents. But this was only the beginning, and what followed would shake the foundations of U.S. security and embarrass some of its most powerful figures. Before Cracka ever dialed that number, the seeds of rebellion had been planted years earlier.
Hey, is anyone
These
there?
kids were not
Yeah, I'm
born
here.
out of nowhere. They grew up in the digital aftermath of Edward Snowden's revelations, in a world where governments were accused of spying on their own citizens, where questions about privacy and power hung in the air like a storm. For default, one of Cracka's closest allies, the path began as early as 2008. He stumbled into underground forums where Anonymous and Anonsec carved
They're
their
always
digital
watching.
graffiti
But we
across
see
the
them
world.
too.
There, hacking was not just a skill, it was a culture, a form of protest, a language of defiance. Default was drawn in like a moth to flame. By his teenage years, he wasn't just a curious kid. He was a believer. He read the stories of whistleblowers. He followed campaigns of hacktivists who claimed to fight corruption. And he started to imagine that he, too, could push back against systems far larger than himself. When he met Cracka online, it was as if two sparks collided. Together, they dreamed of striking blows not for money, not for fame, but for a strange blend of ideology and mischief. They told themselves it was about justice, about exposing the hypocrisy of powerful men.
Yes.
But it was
we need
also
to
about
act fast.
thrill, the adrenaline rush of breaching walls meant to be unbreakable. The group's name, Crackas With Attitude, wasn't chosen by accident. It was brash, mocking, designed to provoke. They weren't afraid of being
It
called
started
reckless.
small,
In fact,
with whispers
they
in the
embraced it.
dark,
And
a
soon,
growing confidence
they would set
that they
their
were
sights
untouchable.
far higher than email accounts. They would go after the very symbols of American intelligence. That sense of invincibility, that belief that they were untouchable because they were young and hidden behind screens, fueled every step they took. But as their ambition grew, so did the risks. And soon, their pranks would morph into something far more dangerous, a digital war that they themselves could not fully control. After breaching Brennan's email, the group's confidence soared.
What is it?
What began as a mischievous stunt quickly evolved into a campaign of calculated humiliation against the most guarded figures in U.S. intelligence. One of their boldest moves came when they targeted James Clapper, the
Can't
Director of
stop us.
National Intelligence, a man whose entire job was to
Hashtag
coordinate
victory.
America's spy networks. Cracka and his crew didn't just read his private emails. They went further, rerouting his home phone so that every incoming call was redirected to a pro-Palestinian organization.
This can't be
Imagine
real.
it. The top intelligence chief of the United States, suddenly unable to control his own phone line, forced into silence while activists picked up his calls. And it wasn't only Clapper. They probed deeper, reaching into the life of FBI Deputy Director Mark Giuliano. With each success, the hackers flaunted their victories on Twitter, taunting the authorities who could not seem to stop them. The climax came in October 2015, when the group leaked hundreds of Brennan's personal documents through WikiLeaks. Among them was the infamous SF-86 security clearance, form of file that laid bare every corner of Brennan's private world. It revealed his financial records, family history, even sensitive details about his psychological profile. For the director of the CIA, a man trained to live in the shadows, it was a public undressing. News outlets across the globe seized on the story. How could the head of America's spy agency be undone by kids barely old enough to drive? The embarrassment was profound, not only for Brennan but for the entire intelligence community. What good were firewalls and classified networks when the weakest link was something as simple as a phone call or a forgotten AOL password? The breach wasn't just about stolen files. It was a symbol, a message to the world that even the mightiest institutions could bleed, and CWA relished every second of it. But as the stakes rose, so too did the attention of the FBI, who began to circle closer and closer to these digital vandals. The deeper they went, the bolder they became. Crackas and Default no longer targeted individuals, they went after entire institutions. Soon, the Department of Justice and the FBI found themselves in the crosshairs of a group of kids who had no training, no funding, only persistence and nerve. Through simple but clever tricks of social engineering, pretending to be who they weren't, charming call center employees into giving them access, they pried open doors that should have been sealed. One night, they slipped into government databases and pulled out names, emails, and phone numbers of nearly 9,000 DOJ staff and over 20,000 FBI employees. It was an avalanche of personal data, and they dumped it online for the world to see. The shockwaves were immediate. Agents had to relocate, phone numbers had to be changed, entire security protocols were rewritten. The cost soared into the millions, at least $1.5 million by official estimates. But the greater cost was invisible. The trust, the credibility of American security agencies crumbled in front of global headlines. And the hackers didn't stop there. They found a way into JABS, a sensitive system that tracked detainees and criminal records. They used it not only to dig but to humiliate, exposing rival hackers and throwing fuel on long-simmering online feuds. What began as pranks now carried real consequences for real lives. At the heart of it all was an intoxicating mix of ideology and arrogance. Crackas waved the Palestinian flag in online statements, proclaiming that their hacks were a strike against U.S. policy in the Middle East. Default echoed the spirit of hacktivists before him, insisting it was about justice and not profit. But the truth was more complicated. For every slogan they posted, there was also laughter, adrenaline, the thrill of playing gods with other people's secrets. The kids had crossed the line, and the FBI knew it. No longer was this a nuisance, it was a national security embarrassment. And every breach brought the agents hunting them one step closer. For a while, Crackas and Default seemed untouchable. They were shadows moving in and out of America's most guarded halls, leaving chaos behind. But like so many who believed in their own invincibility, it was not technology that betrayed them, it was pride. Default, the American half of the duo, had a weakness. He loved to boast. One night, drunk on both alcohol and ego, he bragged too much to someone he thought he could trust. That single moment of carelessness was all it took for the FBI to close the gap. At dawn, agents stormed into his home. What they found was staggering. Hard drives stuffed with stolen files, traces of the DOJ and FBI breaches, and nearly 1,000 Bitcoin stashed away a fortune, even if its origins remained suspicious. The image of federal agents hauling equipment out of a young man's bedroom captured perfectly the absurdity of it all. A kid, once a troll on forums, now in chains for humiliating the world's strongest intelligence apparatus. For Crackas, the story played out differently. He was just 15, hidden in the English Midlands, beyond the direct reach of American courts. British authorities eventually intervened, and while his hacks had rattled the CIA itself, the punishment was softened by his age. He was sentenced to 2 years in a juvenile facility, a far lighter outcome than his partner. Default, however, faced the full weight of the U.S. justice system. In court, prosecutors painted him not as a rebel, but as a criminal who endangered lives. The judge agreed. He was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison and ordered to pay $145,000 in restitution. The boy who once thought of himself as a digital revolutionary was now just another inmate with a number instead of a name. The fall was brutal. From the rush of hacking into Brennan's inbox to the silence of prison walls, the story of CWA had reached its breaking point. But the consequences didn't stop with the boys themselves. Their actions had left a scar on America's sense of security, and the echoes of their hacks would linger long after they were gone. To the outside world, Crackas With Attitude were just kids who stumbled into power they didn't deserve. But inside their own heads, the story was different. They believed they were part of a legacy, an echo of Anonymous, of hacktivists who had once forced governments and corporations to reckon with uncomfortable truths. Default often described their mission as bigger than themselves. He remembered the early days when Anonymous launched digital protests, when hackers claimed they could fight injustice with a keyboard. He carried that banner, telling himself that leaking Brennan's files or exposing FBI contacts was an act of resistance, not of crime. And Cracka, young, reckless, politically charged, often wrapped his attacks in the flag of Palestine. To him, humiliating the CIA was a way of striking back at American policies in the Middle East. Every rerouted phone call, every leaked email was framed as a protest. But between the slogans and hashtags, another reality simmered. They were kids chasing adrenaline. They wanted to feel important, to shock the world, to prove that no wall was too high to climb. The illusion, however, could not erase the damage. Behind the numbers, 9,000 DOJ staff, 20,000 FBI agents were real people. Families uprooted, lives disrupted, entire departments forced to rewire their systems. The cost wasn't just the $1.5 million in damages. It was the fear. If children with no training could do this, what could a hostile nation achieve? In interviews later, Default admitted that part of him wanted to be seen as a kind of digital Robin Hood. But in the cold light of prison, stripped of screens and bravado, it became harder to maintain that fantasy. The law didn't see a rebel. It saw a criminal. The world didn't see heroes. It saw children who had confused recklessness with righteousness. The line between hacktivism and crime had blurred, and when the sentence came down, that line was burned away entirely. The saga of the kids who hacked the CIA did not end in a blaze of glory. It ended in silence, in consequences, in a sobering reminder of how fragile even the strongest walls can be. For the intelligence community, it was a humiliation carved into history. The director of the CIA, the director of national intelligence, the deputy director of the FBI, names that once inspired fear and authority had been reduced to headlines about teenagers with laptops. The revelation was clear. The greatest threats don't always come from foreign armies or enemy states. Sometimes they come from voices cracking with adolescence, armed only with persistence and an internet connection. For Cracka and Default, the lessons were harsher. What had felt like righteous rebellion soon turned into isolation prison walls for one, a juvenile detention center for the other. Their names, once shouted across forums as symbols of defiance, faded into cautionary tales whispered in cybersecurity seminars. The world, too, was left to wrestle with questions that still haunt us today. What is the line between activism and crime? Between exposing secrets for the public good and endangering innocent lives? Edward Snowden had framed himself as a whistleblower. Cracka and Default never had that shield. They had slogans, yes, but they also had laughter, taunts, and bravado. And when the dust settled, the courts didn't weigh intent as much as impact. In the end, perhaps the most chilling truth is not that these kids pulled off the hacks. It is that they did it so easily. A phone call, a careless password, a moment of trust, misplaced. That was all it took to shake the pillars of America's most secretive agencies. And so, the story lingers not as a tale of triumph, but as a warning. Power is fragile. Secrets are only as strong as the humans who guard them. And sometimes, all it takes to expose the cracks is the reckless determination of youth. In the courtroom, Default once said he just wanted to show the world how vulnerable it really was. He succeeded. but the cost was his own freedom.